Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Working Together Against Anti-Black Racism in Ontario's Youth Sector. This is part 2 of a 2-part series on this topic. So thank you for everyone joining us today, and we look forward to our conversation together. We want to start with a land acknowledgement. Youth Rex's provincial office is located at York University. Both Youth Rex and York University acknowledge their presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. A few things to keep in mind for everyone today. We are recording this webinar, and it will be uploaded to both the Youth Rex website and to the Exchange. If you have any trouble with the audio quality today, please try calling in with a phone. We encourage you to ask questions and share your comments. You can submit questions through the webinar using the box on the right side of your screen. We also encourage you to live tweet the webinar today. You can use our handle @RexForYouth. Before we begin, we wanted to share a little bit about Youth Rex, the Youth Research and Evaluation Exchange. Our vision is an Ontario where shared knowledge is transformed into positive impact for all youth, and at Youth Rex, we define knowledge as coming from research, practice, and lived experience. Our mission is to make research evidence and evaluation accessible and relevant to Ontario's youth sector through knowledge exchange, capacity building, and evaluation leadership. We are broadcasting today from our provincial office at York University, and we have regional hubs at Laurentian University, Carleton University, and at King's University College at Western University. We're also in talks to launch a community hub in Windsor in the near future. As we mentioned, Youth Rex does a variety of activities targeting Ontario's youth sector to improve youth well-being. These include knowledge exchange activities like today's webinar, for example, Youth Rex Ed, where we offer workshops and certificates, and youth program supports, a program that we are launching a continuum of services to strengthen your work with youth. We also wanted to draw your attention to the handouts, which you'll find again in the box at the right side of your screen. We have a variety of handouts that you can download, including the slide deck from today's webinar. We also wanted to share Doing Right Together for Black Youth, a report that Youth Rex released in early January of this year that compiles feedback from community engagement sessions for the Ontario Black Youth Action Plan that were held last year. You'll also find 2 fact sheets, one of which outlines the top 10 issues for Black youth that community members identified during the community engagement sessions for the Ontario Black Youth Action Plan. And as I said, this is part 2 of a 2-part webinar series. So if you were not able to join us for part 1 on January 29th, we encourage you to visit the Exchange for Youth Work, which is our online hub for the youth sector in Ontario. And we have posted the recording from the first part of this series on Working Together Against Anti-Black Racism. You will find that in the library for youth work on the Exchange. And now we're going to get into today's session, Working Together Against Anti-Black Racism in Ontario's Youth Sector. And I'm just going to take a moment to introduce our webinar series facilitator and our panelists for today. You may remember Rania El Mugammar from our part 1 of this series. She is our workshop series facilitator. And today's guests include Juliette Allen, Program Director at Delta Family Resource Center, Trevon Edwards, Youth Program Design and Development Associate at Youth Rex, and Kofi Hope, the Executive Director of the CEE Center for Young Black Professionals. And you'll get to know all of these folks throughout today's conversation. And now we're going to take it over our panelists and our hosts for the day, and we encourage you to share your comments and questions throughout today's webinar conversation.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Katie. So we're going to kind of go in a circle and introduce ourselves. But before we do that, I'd like to take a moment to talk about two things to kind of tie into our acknowledgement. The first is to remember and honor Colton Bushi, who was the young Indigenous man who was shot and killed in Battleford in 2016, and whose killer was acquitted on Friday. I think it's really important if we're talking about doing the work of justice in the context of this land to see how injustice manifests, particularly towards Black and Indigenous communities. Secondly, I would like to take a moment to remind those of us who are here today that tomorrow, Thursday, is the emergency deportation hearing for Abdul Abdi, who is the young Black man who came to Canada as a refugee as a toddler and was in state custody for most of his life. And since no one bothered to apply for Canadian citizenship for him, he's now at risk of being deported to Somalia. And I think when we talk about young people and anti-Black racism, that's a clear case where we can see the manifestations of a system of barriers that really brutalized and became quite violent towards Abdul throughout his life. So for those of you who have the capacity to advocate and to support Abdul, you can actually, if you are follow me on Twitter, or if you go to my Twitter page, there's some instructions about some actionable things that you can do to support him. As Katie said, my name is Rania El Mugammar. I am an artist and inclusion, anti-oppression, and liberation consultant working contemporary art institutions, racialized health, communities, and the law, and STEM. And I'm going to hand it off. Do you want to start, Gillette?
Sure. I'm Gillette Allen, and as my title says, I'm currently the program director at Delta Family Resource Center. I've been working in the social service sector for over 20 years. A lot of my work has been around working with youth, in particular Black youth. I've done a lot of work around poverty, a lot of work around anti-oppression. And currently in my own life, I'm doing a lot of work with young people that are currently in the child welfare system, and do some consulting on anti-oppression work and racism.
Thank you. Trevon?
Hi, everyone. My name is Trevon. My background's in child and youth care. Right now, I'm a provincial youth design development associate here at UTHex University. My practice varies very widely. I've done practice at residential centers, educational centers being the schools, youth homeless shelters. And I'm currently also involved in numerous research projects analyzing Black youth leading care and the child welfare system.
Thank you. Kofi? I think we're having a little bit of a technical challenge, folks. Bear with us for a moment. Okay, so I think I'll kind of give us a working definition of what anti-Black racism is until I know for sure that Kofi can hear us. Can you hear us, Kofi?
Yeah, I can hear you now and reconnect.
Okay, amazing. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Kofi Hope. I'm the executive director for the CEE Center for Young Black Professionals, and that stands for CEE is Careers Education Empowerment, and that's what we do. In essence, we provide comprehensive wraparound supports and life supports to young people who are kind of farthest from the labor market, so they've been in conflict with the law or have precarious housing, etc. Been doing this work for a long time, along with having done some academic work where I was looking at North-South solidarity, specifically around the liberation movement in Southern Africa and Canadians' involvements in it, and how the nonprofit space interacted with different political struggles. And I sit on the board of directors for the Toronto Environmental Alliance and the Atkinson Foundation.
Thank you so much for that. So I wanted to invite folks throughout the session. If you have questions, please do send them in through your chat function. if you send in a question, I might not ask it right away because as a facilitator, it might make more sense to ask it in a different point of the conversation, okay? So for us, we're just gonna start off with a little bit of context around anti-Black racism. So kind of a general definition is that it's a form of racism that particularly targets Black, African, and Afro-diasporic peoples. This term identifies the ways in that social racism and systemic racism particularly targets and harms Black communities and individuals. Anti-Black racism has internalized, interpersonal, and institutional manifestations. All racism is rooted in anti-Blackness in the context of this land. All racism is also rooted in colonialism and anti-Indigenous racism. Particularly, the anti-Blackness is a currency that everybody trades in. It's the most accessible currency of white supremacy. So understanding it as such means that we have to address anti-Black racism specifically rather than having large, broad, overarching conversations about racism in general. So I'm gonna get into the questions. The time you'll notice will be like flying by. So if we don't get through everything, feel free to tweet at me and I'll do my best to come back at you with resources or connect you with individuals who might be able to answer your questions. So the first question that I'm gonna ask folks is, why is it important to examine anti-Black racism through an intersectional lens? Is anybody feeling brave enough to go first?
So just speaking to myself, as a Black male, I understand that the Black culture within itself is very complex. And as a Black person, I'm not just Black. I can be Jamaican. I can be from a continent within Africa. So being Black is very diverse within itself. So intersectionality as a tool allows us to see how intersecting identities may allow for further marginalization or kind of a separate identity within itself, right? So when we just look at Black as an overarching theory, we kind of muddle what being Black really is. And using intersectionality allows us to see specificities that may target certain groups and disproportionately or disparately impact certain groups.
I think it's also important that we look at intersectionality because, as Trayvon says, we all come with different identity, and that Black is it's very complex when we say that we're Black, right? I mean, I'm Black, I'm a woman, I could be disabled, and the disability might not be visible. I could belong to the LGBT community, and so you just can't just use that one term to paint us all, because we all come with different identities, with different needs. And if we don't look at intersectionality, then we don't meet people's needs or meet them where they're at. For example, Black folks belonging to the LGBT community often get overlooked, often get left out of conversations. And so it's really important that we look at our intersecting identities and how we're going to work with people and how best we can serve them. And so in working with young people, it's very important for them to understand that they come with multiple identities, and that the best way for them to get service is that service providers understand this and see this.
Yeah, I think, we need to acknowledge that there's been a historical lens for approaching the kind of Black struggle in North America that's perceived the struggle mainly through the lens of the male, straight, Christian Black experience. And so many stories get lost, but that is kind of our default when we look to the civil rights movement and these other struggles. That's what many people hold in their minds when they think about Black identity, but also experiences of anti-Black racism. And so it's critical to take an intersectional approach so that we can look at these different aspects and also realize two things. One, that oppressions can exist within our own community.
Yes.
We can think of homophobia or transphobia or ableism or the different discrimination people can face within the Black community that we also need to acknowledge as we're fighting, the societal structures around us. We also have to do that self-work internally about the oppressions that manifest within our communities, shadeism being another one that's, top of mind to think about. And also that has a real impact as far as programming goes. Many of the Black focused programs that have existed historically have taken an African, not against, but many times has come from a lens of kind of grounding Africanness in West African culture and West African identity. And I know when we were starting C, we did focus groups with 100 Black youth across the city. And one of the things that was clear was people said, we don't want to we want programs that are based around Blackness. We don't want to go somewhere where someone is preaching to us about what it means to be Black, because there are Black communities in Toronto versus one community. And within that, for some folks, their understanding of their Blackness might be rooted, if you're East African, it may be rooted in your, ethnic identity. For some people, it's within their Somali identity, or within Islam was a big part of their Black identity. For folks in Southern Africa, it can be other points that you're looking to, from Afro-Latino, there's language, etc. And so I think it's really important.
I think we've lost.
Yeah, I think we've lost
Black, and if you don't fit into these boxes, then there's something wrong with you, or you're an other, versus embracing all of those different Black identities in one safe space.
Thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead, Gillette.
Oh, sorry, and I was going to say, I think a piece of that is just really important because, lately that I've been working with a lot of young people, the whole term Black just seems so confusing to them, that I'm not just Black. And so what Kofi's saying, that with all these different identities and these different things that can make you a Black person, I think it's so critical for our young people to understand that there's a lot of this differentness, because what happens is when they face anti-Black racism, those daily microaggressions, I think once they have an understanding of the intersectionality, I think they can best then address some of those issues that are coming at them. So I think that's really key, as we move forward and work with young people in our communities, because I think there's been a lot of confusion around, as I was saying earlier in our conversation, this whole thing of Black versus African, like, so what am I? Who am I? And what makes me Black and what makes me different, So I think really having that conversation within our community, and for us to come up with a narrative and not for somebody else to define that narrative for us, I think is just really important.
Thank you. I think, speaking from my own lived experience as a queer, Black, immigrant, Muslim woman living in the inner city, for me, intersectionality is not just a theory or a buzzword, it's a radical practice, right? It is one of the biggest functions of racism is that it reduces entire, diverse multitudes of Blackness into a monolithic group. And it doesn't allow you the humanity of being nuanced and full of contradictions and layers and texture and the things that make people people. And I think, the best function of intersectionality is that it allows us to think about who's chronically excluded. Okay, who's excluded even when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and access and equity? Who doesn't get a seat at those tables still? And the thing about, when we don't practice intersectionality, we reinforce really harmful power structures by saying this is who matters inside our communities, this is the order in which they matter, and that there's a hierarchy for liberation. We know that oppressions are interlinked, they amplify and inform each other, and that people are not pie charts. We don't have our experiences independent based on specific facets of our identities. Some days I wish I had a form when I'm experiencing some kind of oppression. I'm like, could you check off what's going on here? Is it all of the above? Because I need some clarification around it. And being, I think a Black youth know intersectionality, whether or not they use those words to describe it, because they live it every single day. And the thing about a lack of intersectional analysis when we're talking about anti-Black racism is that it robs us of the opportunity to address issues within our communities that Kofi was talking about. I think that's really critical. When we think of our communities as intersectional, then we can totally address the harm that our communities experience as a large Black community, but also the harm that we produce and recreate inside our communities and our spaces. So I feel like that those are the kind of summary points that I had in terms of that, and also that all of our Blacknesses are coming into our Blackness, and our understanding of our Black identities happens in different contexts. So for someone like me, who's an East African immigrant, the context of my Blackness is constructed against largely an Arab world, and then I immigrate to Canada and inherit a history of Blackness here too. So navigating that and having space to hold, both realities and both lived experiences is really important. I'm wondering if anyone else has thoughts, challenges, disagreements.
No, I think you're right. I mean, myself, I've been immigrated from Jamaica at a very young age. I knew I was Black growing up. I knew it was of African heritage, but I think it was just compounding when I came here, and then that's all people saw, that you're a young Black girl, and that became very important. But growing up in the Caribbean, I was more concerned about classism, right? It was more about class, not having those who have and those who don't have, right? But then coming here to Canada, like my race became front and center. And so everything that I did and the way that I grew up and all the experiences that I had, race was played a major role in that, in forming my identity in this place, right? So I think you're totally right about that.
Do you have anything to add, Tron?
Yeah, even myself, so I'm born in Canada, and I've always had this thing with education where I've never really understood my experience through words. I've only kind of expressed it through feelings, right? I felt this way about school, and I felt like I was being treated differently. And I remember having a group of friends, and we were pretty diverse in terms of who was part of this group, and I didn't understand why certain things felt like it was only happening to me, right? Even though we were all males, and you boys are getting in trouble today, right? Once again. And I felt like certain microaggressions and things were happening specifically to me. And intersectionality are really allowed as a tool, like now in my latter years, to kind of see why certain things may be due to race, certain things may be due to class, certain things may be due to age. And I really feel this is a powerful tool that we need to kind of practice, as you mentioned before, Renee, like practice, because it's a really complex thing that doesn't come overnight with understanding. So the ability to practice and just have an awareness of what intersectionality is and when it can be a useful tool is very important for our Black community.
I think to build on that, intersectionality, is a great tool, yes, to look internally. So to help recognize one's own power and privilege that you bring into situations and spaces. And, that's something for me. I've, spent many years doing organizing and work within the Black community. But as someone with a mixed heritage, one of the important things I grappled with and had some really good folks who helped me on that journey when I was doing leadership was talking about shadism, was talking about the privilege I bring from having connections to different communities and also having connections to the majority culture in Canada and maybe a familiarity or direct link that others didn't have. And without intersectionality, like I think Black solidarity and Pan-Africanism and these concepts are so critical. But if we don't take that intersectional lens, sometimes we miss the way in which we have power and privilege that manifest in different spaces, and way in which we silence or exclude other voices and kind of take those things for granted. And so to me, it's as much about a tool we bring to young people and others as it is a tool for critical self-analysis. And I think when we have that, it just makes us better leaders within our own community.
Thank you so much for that, Kofi. I think I relate to that a lot. As when Black people are invited to the table, I'm frequently the person who gets the phone call. And I think really like really positioning yourself in a way that's really intersectional and understanding that lets you be critical even when you're being included in particular spaces and contexts, right? So, I mean, recently I was invited to speak at a panel and I sort of looked at it and I was like, am I really the only Black person you know? Why are you always calling me? and I mean, yeah, totally. That's my work and I understand that, but there's a lot of Black voices that are not ever getting an invitation to be on a panel, right? And I think that's really important for those who have who are participating in this webinar today, who have influences, programmers and organizers and that kind of thing. It's like, are you always inviting the 5 Black people that you know who do this work? And what do they look like me? Because I'm aware of like how my particular phenotype and the way that I look gets me access into spaces that other Black people don't get, and particularly other Black women, trans and queer Black people don't get. As a queer person who's very straight passing, entering spaces like that is a lot easier for me than it is for someone who maybe they perform their gender in a different way. They are out in a different way than I am as a queer person, or are visibly Muslim, unlike me. I'm Muslim, but I'm not visibly Muslim. So having these being really critical is really important, because when Black youth see themselves reflected in who's doing the work, who's having the conversations, that's really important for quote unquote inclusion. And then also it's important from a design place for people, right? Is that it helps you, intersectionality helps you think about who is the most marginalized, you center those people, and then you design backwards. Everybody else is included by default when we do that, right? And when people tell me, oh, it's a program for Black youth, I'm like, okay, which Black youth? They look at me. No, people look at me like I'm not. I'm like what? I'm like, no, really. Which Black youth? Make me a list. Who? You know?
And I think class is one of those key pieces. And when we see in
Yes.
spaces that, yes, you can have Black bodies in the space or in leadership roles, but are we having folks who had lived experience in marginalized communities? Are we
Yes.
having folks who had experience coming as newcomers and having to work their way into the system? Are we just getting Canadian-born middle-class Black folks? There's nothing wrong with that, but are those the voices that are predominating in the space? Are those the voices who become the spokespeople or gatekeepers for community? That's when there's a problematic approach. And, with our program, one of the things we really wanted to think about was the fact that every 5-10 years, there's gun violence in this city that is suddenly becomes part of the national or provincial consciousness. People look at it, they say, oh my gosh, this is an issue. Money appears in community, but many times that money never gets to those youth
Who need it.
who are
Yeah.
actually at risk or involved in the violence because of a process of creaming where agencies take the money and say, yes, we're going to serve Black youth, but they serve those that are easiest to serve.
Serve.
They serve the keeners, those who are already connected to leadership programs, those who might be from, a different class background, etc. And the youth that, are hardest to serve, who might be living, in precarious housing, have a tattoo on their neck, may have had a conflict with the law, all those pieces, they tend to never get access to the money or the resources because they're the more difficult ones to serve. So when we built C, that was a core value to say we actually want to seek out the most marginalized and we want to purposefully build programming for them because they're the ones, as a young person said in Jane Finch, it was kind of our blood money that led to this funding. And yet we don't see any of it. And that's an injustice, and you can't solve it if you don't take an intersectional approach.
I'm glad that Kofi is raising that point because now that we have the Ontario Black Youth Action Plan and all that money from the province that's currently being divvied out, to serve Black youth, and that's one of the things that I've reflected on. Who's being served? Are the Black youth who are the most marginalized in the city being served? Or are we doing the same old and getting to those who are just easy? That's just going to make our life easy, make our jobs easy. So I'm really glad that that Kofi raised that point. And I'm hoping that with these dollars that's coming out from the Ontario Black Youth Action Plan, that it really does get down to those young people that are most marginalized. The ones that are, exiting out of the child welfare system, the ones that are in child welfare system, the ones who are living in precarious housing, the ones who are underemployed are the hardest to be employed. I'm hoping that, and some of the programming, that they're giving money for, some of it doesn't even make sense. So again, when we're thinking about programming, as I was saying earlier to Trayvon, my evaluator, have young people evaluate some of these things that we're talking about. Were they at the table when you decided that this was something that they needed, So I think it's really important that we raise that issue, and intersection really is key to that conversation.
And I think as a practical point for a lot of maybe frontline practitioners, managerial practitioners, it's important for us to be aware of what's happening around our social context in Ontario. So being aware of this amount of money that's being held up here and it's being dispersed as such, and paying a keen ear to programs that are receiving these monies because this directly impacts our work. So as practitioner or as advocates, we need to be aware of what's happening so that way we can best serve our young people to our fullest capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to kind of change directions and we're going to circle back around to some of the strategy and practices pieces. I'd like for us to have a little bit more context before we dive right into it. Thank you so much for your insights. You'll notice that I'm taking notes too. I always love when I get to be in conversation with people that I'm taking something away and learning. I always do, often. So the question that I'm going to go to next is, why is it important to collect demographic-based data and particularly race-based data that uses Black as a category for that research?
Yeah. Okay, my screen highlighters. I think it's me. Okay. So race-based data. I'll never forget in one of my classes, I've heard one of my friends say, I'm not too sure why everything is being focused to Black people. I know there's a lot going on in the community, but why is it focusing on Black people? And I sat there with it. I really didn't have a solid answer at the time. So I had to really start to do my homework and understand that in order to kind of solve something, we need to have a laser point focus on things that are happening within that community. So when we look at places like, or systems such as the child welfare system, CS Toronto, for example, that has an overrepresentation of Black youth, right? About 41% of youth in Toronto and children aged society of Toronto is Black, right? If we don't have this race-specific data, we're not understanding specific disparities and proportionalities that are impacting certain groups. And to add back to that point of intersectionality, right? When we look at the child welfare system and we have young people that are identifying with the LGBT community, right? And we're noticing that, hey, when they're involved with child welfare and they're identifying with this group, they actually end up homeless at an extremely scary rate, right? So race-based data allows for us to really put that laser focus in and allow for strategic and intentional programming to support that demographic.
Thank you.
Well, I've been very much involved with the city's process with the anti-Black racism work that's been happening. And I did some work with a panel of experts who do data collection. And, one of the things that we identify that it's, as Trayvon was saying, that it's really important for us to have this data, because all too often, when we try to look at the Black community and just to see some of the disproportionality that's happening, we always have to go to US data. It's high time for us. The Black community here in Canada is large enough. We've been here for a long time. Certain issues have been affecting us and impacting our community with very poor outcomes. And I think it's high time for us to have the data to show how this is happening. And again, once we have the data, then we can start looking at how to resolve some of these issues.
Thank you. Kofi? Can you hear us? Do you have anything to add, Kofi?
He's hearing.
Yeah, I think we've lost him there for a moment.
Yeah, and sorry, folks, my connection sometimes is going in and out. Yes. So,
okay, so I'm going to circle back to Kofi in a moment, and I'm going to make some points that I think kind of feed off of what both Trayvon and Gillette were saying, which is the fact that when we collect data, this demographic-based data, I really encourage the collection of intersectional data. Again, that is how we practice intersectionality as a radical practice and rather than a theory. That lets us understand who's in the margins of the margins. Also, both quantitative and qualitative data. I think often we tend to focus on the numbers side of things, and as much as that's really good at showing us large trends, we want to see how they manifest in really complicated ways. Second, there's often a conversation around why do we collect data that's specific to Black as a category. And the reason for that is whenever we collect data that's under people of color that includes Black people, and then we go back and we collect data that separates Black and people of color into separate groups, you see there's a massive disparity. So we know that racism and anti-Blackness particularly targets Black communities in ways that make us, live precarious and vulnerable lives. So to get a really good understanding of that, we need to do that this way. And also it leaves from like a personal place. When you have the data, it leaves you not fighting with people about proving your lived experience. That's an exhausting place that youth are the resident experts on their lives. However, they are not treated as such. And the result of that is they are constantly being faced with people who have privileges that they don't, and then having to prove to those people that, one, you have a privilege that I don't have, two, my lived experience is real, three, my pain and my suffering and my exclusion and the barriers that are faced are valid. And that's a whole lot to do before you get to school at 8 o'clock in the morning, So this is a burden that's on the shoulders of a lot of Black youth, is their believability.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know, Kofi, do you want to speak to?
Yeah, I think I'm back with you for now at least. Folks have covered a lot of it, but it's interesting because I was in Ottawa on Monday and we were talking to federal cabinet ministers and doing some lobby work, and that was the #1 demand for every ministry we spoke to was disaggregated race-based data. and specifically the trend you were speaking about, Rania, around this idea of visible minority. One of the recent things, there was a study and some stats released around post-secondary education. And one of the things you understand about education with our community that's different than, say, the South Asian community or East Asian community is the fact that rates of educational success and attainment go down each generation Black folks have been in Canada. And that moves a different way than for other communities, but it gets lost in the data. But what to me is so important about that, and why that's really important for us to understand, is we can say, this isn't about people bringing problematic cultures from other parts of the world. This isn't a problem with Somali culture coming to Canada, or Jamaican culture coming to Canada, or Ghanaian culture coming to Canada. Actually, when people come with those cultural understandings and nuances, they do better in Canada. It is part of the experience of being Black in Canada that is leading to some of our systematic oppression. And the longer we're here, the more that tends to become ingrained. And so this is really about what Canadian culture does to us as opposed to what we bring here. And being able to make that argument, you can say it anecdotally or academically. When you actually have the stats, and I was there in the room, when you say it to a cabinet minister and say, we have the data behind it, suddenly they have to take you seriously. And say, wow, okay, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that. And so it is so critical for us to win, and it is sometimes a fight, win these battles, to advocate for the changes we need, to have the data to back it up. And there's this, accounting term that people use that say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And in many ways, I think that's true, that even for us with best intentions and our analysis from our individual place, it's hard to see the big picture. And it's very easy to waste some of our limited resources and time and intellectual capital on activities that may not be the most successful if we don't have the data to help tell us, are we making progress here? Are these certain types of programming working? Are we seeing graduation rates going up? Are we seeing engagement? Are we seeing that amount of youth in care going down? Without the data, we're kind of shooting in the dark. And I think, as someone who's worked on the ground for a long time, I've seen lots of money that hasn't been the best spent. And I think it's a shame every time a dollar for our community doesn't properly go to our community. And so data is one of those tools. It's not a guarantee. And you need that qualitative data as well about the texture of people's lives. But those quantitative numbers help us to make sure the interventions we're doing are the most effective and targeted in the right place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Juliette, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I was going to say that, but it's, with all that being said, I think it's also important as to who is collecting the data. So that's something that we need to be very mindful as we move forward with race-based data collection, that it's those of us, it's our community that's collecting that data and controlling that narrative. Because all too often we know researchers come into a community, they get the data, and then they can spin that data to their likeness, right? So I think it's important that, we're the ones in charge of doing that. And so we can control our own narratives going forward.
Thank you. I think that's critical. Yeah, Trevon?
Touch on that point. I'm loving this conversation. I just feel overwhelmed with thoughts and dialogue. But historically, research has been utilized to further oppress and marginalize our community, right? And when we hear research on Black youth in general, it typically takes a very negative tone, right? When we know that being Black is being resilient, it's being strong, and we navigate these racist institutions on a regular basis, right? And to touch back to Kofi's point around understanding race-based data and systems, when we look at the educational system, for example, and we have an instructor or a teacher that may have a colorblind perspective, and they're teaching that within a position of influence and power, it's scary, because now we're having a teacher that can't see me for who I am and understand me, right? From more so than my aesthetics, right? More so for my story, that this is what I've gone through in society historically, and this is where I am right now, right? And we look at the child welfare sector, for example. Until recently with Bill 89, we didn't know that maybe Black girls had exceptional hair and needed some more treatment, right? So that wasn't a part of the daily culture in child welfare, right? We didn't know that certain celebrations needed to be celebrated with certain groups, right? When we put a Black young woman in a home with a white family, there may be nothing wrong on the outside, but when we think about the cultural needs of that young Black woman, are those being thought about, right? And without that race-based data, we wouldn't have understand that, whoa, this demographic is being impacted at a disproportional rate.
Thank you. I think something that's that both I think everyone's touched on is the fact that when we have the data, it can inform our programming and amplify our impact, right? If we are going out there and we're making programming for Black youth without the context around it, how do we really know that it's needed? How do we know that it's impactful? How do we set hard targets and then measure and evaluate those targets without the data for context? And another thing that I think is like from like a larger cultural place is that it helps us to confront that meanwhile in Canada narrative that really like silences already oppressed people in the context of Canada by being like, well, at least it's not bad as the United States, right? When we start to get race-based data, for example, when CAS started collecting that race-based data, our communities have long known there was a problem. Our communities have long feared their children being disproportionately removed from their family care and placed in state custody in that way. And now there's tangible quote unquote evidence to have those conversations. And then when you have complementary research, when you have research that looks at family violence in Black communities relative to other communities and says actually pretty much it's on par with other communities, and then you have data that says that Black children are being removed disproportionately from their homes, we can very easily then draw the conclusion that there is anti-Black racism at play, as opposed to people saying, well, you know, it's because there's a cultural context of abuse in Black families. So then we can, when we have research that's happening in a cross-sectoral capacity, we can really make really informed programming and funding decisions. And at the end of the day, make sure that not just 2 cents of every dollar is actually end up in the Black community. Kofi's example around educational attainment was really critical. Another example that I've been working with in terms of the racialized health is looking at maternal health and birth weight of Black children. So for in the States, African American women who are intergenerationally African American, children had the lowest birth weight. Now, continental African immigrant women, children's birth weight was on par with white children, but their children's birth weight dropped. So then it showed us that there was that it was actually systemic racism that was or is the key factor in making or impacting both maternal and infant health. So being able to have that data can help us really understand the institutionalized nature of anti-Blackness and all the different ways in which it impacts the physical health, the well-being, the success, the thriving, the survival of Black people in Canada. So I think for me, those are like some of the larger pieces around that conversation. And the reason for that data to be like really comprehensive and intersectional is that when people are talking about the educational attainment of Black youth, that was a conversation that was happening a lot south of the border. And then more comprehensive data came out and said, actually, Black women have the highest educational attainment of any group in the United States. Okay, so then obviously there then became a gender lens and a conversation around why is there this disparity and this gap? What can we do to target? You know, how can we, what role does Black girl magic play in that, really, in the sense that like what role does the resilience of Black women and the ways in which we're socialized in particular ways contribute to our educational attainment? So there's a lot of pieces of the conversation that I think the data can really help provide context. And the data also stops people from having to tell the same stories over and over again. It's a very exhausting and traumatizing to have to parade your pain in all these ways. You're suffering on a personal level and your community, and then for your children to have to do it and for their children to have to do it, it feels like defeat in a lot of ways. So I think if we're talking about things like the mental health and the well-being of Black youth in our programming, we have to consider how that really informs that. So I'm going to ask if anybody else has final thoughts to add to the data question before we move on. And I'm also going to invite our participants. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to share them. And if you would like further clarification on something as well.
I just think to reiterate the point, and I think it's great, and Trevon mentioned it, and Rania, you talked about it with the example around Black women and educational rates, that we really make a conscious effort to seek out data that shows the assets of our community along with the disparities. because many times, I've had this conversation with folks working in the city and in the civil service who've said, if you guys always lead with disparities, yes, it may help you in the short term to get that funding, but in the long term, it reinforces these stereotypical views on our community that, actually harm us down the road. And so how do we, and that's one of the, ways in which anti-Black racism puts us in a box, right? Where we have to prove our struggle and pain in order to move forward our agenda. But at the same time, we have to try to find ways to fight the stereotypes and so-called truths that anti-Black racism has about Black underachievement, Black incompetence, Black deprivation. And so I think we have to make a conscious effort, as those of us who are knowledge creators, to balance the ones that talk about gaps with ones that show where we're succeeding and where we're doing better than the norm.
Yeah, that's important for model setting and for practices too. So what's worked is getting to the celebratory things are really important too, because they're showing us what our communities are doing and what maybe potentially service providers are doing to support our community's efforts to do something that has worked, so that we can learn from not only do we just problematize practices in that way, but then we can also look at what solutions and what things we've always done that have worked thus far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I think that was a really critical point. So I think I'm going to ask the advocacy question at this point. So what is the role of advocacy in addressing anti-Black racism inside the youth work sector and in our communities as a whole?
Yeah. So just kind of reflecting some of my earlier child and youth work days as a student and as a practitioner, it's hard. It's very, very, very difficult work, especially in the front lines, and people really often don't understand when they're not in the front lines. And advocacy is one of the most powerful tools I think we have, but yet it's often one of the most difficult tools to actually use, especially when you're working in an institution or system to that regard that may not be supportive of that advocacy, right? Of actually empowering and amplifying that youth voice. And I've sat there and I've almost been I was never forced, but I was almost in a position where I felt stuck and I wasn't able to advocate for a young person to the best of my ability, because I didn't want my manager to potentially fire me. I didn't want all the staff members to say I didn't have their back. I didn't want the staff to kind of gather around in the shift change room and talk about me behind my back. And it hurts, right? Not only for myself, but then to go home and have to reflect on what that young person might have been feeling within that moment. So I feel advocacy, especially in the role of anti-Black racism, needs to be done at various levels. One being the management level, right? We have to allow for room for our frontline practitioners to bring forth conversations and challenges to the institution that we surround and work with, right? If our practitioners who are working every day alongside these young people feel there's injustices being done but can't speak to it because they're worried they're going to get fired and they can't pay their bills to support their own family, there's an issue, right? And if us as practitioners have a blind eye towards what something our colleagues are doing, and we're then perpetuating these injustices. So advocacy within ourselves and in the institution needs to be placed at a higher priority, where we feel safe and have a culture of allowing for voice, and not only from the practitioners and the management, but the young people, not taking what they're saying so lightly. Because oftentimes we hear a young person voice their concerns like, yeah, but they're a kid, right? What do kids really know, right? They're kids. When in actuality, a lot of the most influence comes from the young people. So we have to be mindful of that contradiction. So I would just say advocacy needs to be embedded not only through our daily practice, but within the culture of institutions and systems.
Yeah, I think, when you speak about people feeling limited in their ability to advocate as frontline workers within the system, we can also take that up to a higher level where organizations have been consistently, for over a generation, depoliticized in Canada, right? Our nonprofit sector has shifted from where it was, say, in the 70s and even into the 80s, and with some groups today, where these were membership-based volunteer structures, where when funding was given by government, it was core funding, and nonprofits saw themselves as having a critical voice in advocating. We've moved towards nonprofits primarily becoming government subcontractors. And that voice and that ability, that space to take stances, especially to take critical or radical stances, has been slowly taken away. And so it becomes very hard, right? We all know about what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. pay their bills. And many organizations feel that they're in that place, that we might see an issue with this funding. We might see an issue with how this structure goes. We might see an issue with this ministry or whatever it is. But we stay silent because we realize to speak out, to be seen as the rabble rousers or whatever it is, means our next grant may not get funded. And then we're having to let go staff. People can't feed their families. Our organization dwindles. We're marginalized as a group. And so that is the real struggle, I think, for many of our agencies. And how can we find a voice and navigate this system that is so program-based and so deliverable-based and leaves very little role for that voice? But I think we have to do it. And we also have to understand that advocacy comes in different ways, right? That there's a real role for the radicals who will get in the streets, who will make demands that may seem impossible today. We'll just kick doors in and physically do what's necessary to be heard. But there's also a role for those folks who are going to go and meet with the politicians and are going to work on policy behind closed doors, who might look for compromise, who might seek allies. And there's not one way to be revolutionary or one way to be progressive. And actually, we need to see that the different ways in which Black folks advocate for our issues can be complementary to each other. But I think we as a community, as has always historically been, and especially in progressive circles, sometimes we spend so much time arguing with each other or critiquing each other's approaches because they're not pure enough. We miss the point that actually a variety of voices and a variety of advocacy tactics actually help move things forward. And we look at historical struggles, whether it was South African liberation or in the civil rights movement, there were a variety of voices. There was a variety of approaches. And it was that mix. And when people could coordinate and respect the different spaces people were advocating from, that you saw things really pushing forward.
I don't even know if I have any more to add to that, but I echo everything that both Trayvon and Kofi has said. And I just really want to highlight the piece that Kofi mentioned about, you know, the divisiveness sometimes amongst each other because we can't agree or critique each other's way of doing advocacy. And as he says, advocacy can be done in so many different ways. There's those of us who are the silent, you know, we do it silently. We're behind closed doors. We're making those phone calls. We're writing those letters. You know, we're going out there with a young person to meet with a teacher or meet with a school administrator. And so, you know, it's coming together and just meshing all those different styles of doing advocacy that's going to be important to our young people. And also really teaching our young people how to advocate for themselves as well and forming alliances and having allies. I think all too often, you know, sometimes we don't let young people know that sometimes you can advocate on your own behalf. But yes, you're going to need that support, and I will be that person behind you. But sometimes you have to be the face of the advocacy for yourself, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Thank you. So I think some of the points that are all of the points you've made are brilliant. I think what's really important to remember is there are no perfect advocates or activists. That building perfect advocates or activists is often quite exclusionary, quite classist, quite centered in a lot of academic discourse that those of us with a lot of expertise, knowledge, and real survival toolkits don't have access to. So making sure that that's something that is at the forefront of our mind, that we do the work everywhere, inside the system, outside the system, all around it, that even the work that happens inside the system that, you know, someone who's like me, that often people think I'm a bit further in the quote unquote radical place, whatever that means, is that I'm not necessarily working inside institutions in that capacity, but I see the value in it. That's the work of equity. That's the work of harm reduction. I see how it contributes to our community surviving, and that there's everybody's capacities, skills, and resources are directed in whatever place they can make the most impact. So there's all sorts of ways to do the work. And then also the fact that advocacy, you have to build advocacy into the culture of your organization or your space so that people don't feel loyal to your organization and not the communities you serve, that people are not advocating for your institution and not for the youth that are supposed to be benefiting from it. So there was an audience or participant question at this point. So the question is, what do we need to do to give kids and frontline workers a voice? But what do you think specifically needs to happen to foster a sense of safety for young people or youth to have their voice heard and their experiences validated?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a very multi-layered question. So I'm just gonna try to take it piece by piece. So I think the first step is the awareness, right? Having an awareness of your surroundings, the consciousness of the institution and policies and dynamic in your set organization. And then the second piece is dialogue, right? Because nothing can move forward without addressing it, right? And that's typically done through the initial dialogue of having a conversation with the young person and the managerial staff and kind of the governing people at the top in one room, right? Kind of pointing out the pink elephant in the room, right? And I think it's also important that we allow innovation and advocacy to be innovative within our institutions, right? So for example, I had some young people that were really on Twitter and Facebook, and a lot of the other staff didn't really see purpose in allowing them to express themselves through these mediums. When I started to do my research this year, and I found out great movements like Black Lives Matter hashtag actually started through Twitter, right? So there's a lot of room for what they call slacktivism and these innovative ways of allowing young people to express themselves, right? The question was very multifaceted, but I think my point is to allow for that conversation, right? Kind of address that issue of lack of safety within an organization, and also keep in mind the innovation of advocacy and how that looks through different lenses and perspectives, whether that be young person, your perspective, kind of cliche way of how it's been done in the past.
I think two things. One is that when it comes to safety, as an organization, you have to provide different means for people to advocate and bring complaints forward, including anonymous ones that protect the identities of young people, but allow them to say, something's not right with that youth worker. Yeah. And we're seeing things that, just don't add up. But for a young person to feel that they can safely say that and bring that complaint forward, you've got to have systems that welcome that and that protect them. It's just like a whistleblower anywhere else, but especially with a young person, where if they speak out and they see things that aren't going the way they are, the way an organization or staff can put pressure on them. And so you have to protect those people that have the bravery and courage to speak out. And if you have that kind of culture, then it will encourage others. The other piece is that, and this was my favorite class when I went to the University of Toronto, we took a class about advocacy and learning that advocacy is actually a skill and something that can be taught and learned and built on and practiced like other skills, and that we take for granted the class-based approach. That one of the key parts of middle-class identity is understanding how these mainstream systems work and understanding how to weave and bob and get things and call Joe, and then you go here, and how to write the letter in the right way and to whom it may concern, and all these pieces to get the resources from the system. And sometimes that experience of marginality or poverty means there isn't that same familiarity with how to get these systems to give you the goods. And that's one of the things I've learned, and what we try to do in our programming is show people some of those secrets, some of those tips that they may not have gotten from their family, from their parents, about how you work these systems. And also that entitlement that comes as a middle class person to go to their school and say, no, what's happened in the classroom was wrong, or the way you're trying to stream my child was wrong, and I'm not going to have it, and I'm going to call the superintendent or the school board trustee. Many times, if you haven't had that experience in a middle class environment, you don't have that courage or even know that you have a right to demand that. And so I think what we do supporting youth is to help teach these tricks if we know them ourselves, or to continue to educate ourselves about ways to effectively advocate and give those tools to the young people.
Gillette, thank you so much, Kofi.
I know. After Kofi talked, there's not much to say, right? Because Kofi, you got it. No, it's true. And there is this sense of entitlement for those of us who are from the middle class, because you can pick up the phone and call this person that leads you to another person to be able to maneuver the system and get the results that you want. I remember a few weeks ago, I got a phone call from a colleague who's doing some work in the TDSB, and a mother was going to meet, with a superintendent at one of the boards, and was basically asking me, so who do we know that could accompany this person? Because this was something that she had never done before. And just ensuring that when she goes in there, that she's able to present well, and just understanding the system and just understanding languages to use and how to speak, and not to be seen as the angry Black women, right? Mm-hmm. So, just having that conversation with her, even though we couldn't find somebody to accompany her, but just really prepping her to go into that meeting that she could get the results that she wanted for her child. So Kofi is definitely right when he says that a lot of our families that are living in poverty and don't have access to these systems or to persons who can advocate on their behalf or accompany them to do the advocacy, that we really do need to teach them the skill to be able to go in and do some of this work on their own. But, always ensuring that we can always provide them with some type of support, because maneuvering these large systems is very intimidating. It's very scary. And if you don't have the right words or the right actions, people can just excuse you and just kind of overlook you. And so I really believe that teaching advocacy skills to our young people from a very early age is really important.
Mm-hmm. I think there's, in terms of this is a point that everybody touched upon, which is the fact that what's the culture of your organization, right? Is there a criminalization of dissent? Do you reward young people and colleagues and team members, people who work in staff, for falling in line and kind of echoing the whatever the company line is in whatever place? Do you invite critique? Are you always reactionary to it? I think that's the safe channels piece that Kofi is talking about. You can invite critique. You can absolutely invite it and have a way to engage it and have a process around it. It doesn't have to throw us off, and we don't have to take it personally. So many people, I see that when there's that position of advocacy, or when young people are saying this is not okay, are offended by it on a personal level. And I'm like, okay, your feelings are really not what's important in this situation right about now, right? Like, somebody's telling you about something really oppressive happening inside your space. That to me is really, that's a critical piece to talk about. And then also how we dismiss the advocacy and the critique of certain individuals based on their social location and their identity. That was some of the piece around being the angry Black woman that Gillette brought up, is that, like, are we dismissing young people as, they're young and unwise and they don't know any better? Whereas, they actually live a particular life every day, and that life has informed their worldview and has given them and sensitized them to experiences that some of us may not be aware of. And another part of it is apologize when you're wrong, fam. Okay, this is really, I cannot stress this enough, right? Is that this is so critical, is that people are terrible at apologizing, both interpersonally and institutionally, and encourage that in your staff. Right? If we're wrong, can you own it? I'm going to walk you through, this is a whole workshop that I teach, actually called The Anatomy of an Apology, because I realize people are shit at apologizing. So here is the recipe, or the anatomy of an apology. First, acknowledgement. This is the bearing witness piece. I acknowledge that the following has actually happened. We gaslight people who are marginalized so frequently into thinking their experiences didn't happen, or that they're not the way that they perceive them. Second, emotional uptake. Emotional uptake is the opposite of emotional dismissal. Your feelings are valid. You're entitled to feel the emotion that you feel, for the intensity that you feel it, for the duration of time that you feel it. Not, I think you're overreacting. Don't you think you're being sensitive? If I were you, I'd be more upset than anything. I don't think it's that offensive. Okay? Third is accountability, owning our actions in it and not providing 5,000 pieces of actually irrelevant context. I was having a bad day and my cat is sick, and we just have a lot of we're understaffed. When we say that, it means you're not a priority, right? So being really conscious and just owning it, the accountability piece. Next, change behavior. An apology does not mean shit without change behavior. Where institutions and individuals are apologizing for the same behavior over and over again, it starts to get offensive. It's obviously you think I'm a fool because you're not sorry, because you're still doing what you said you wouldn't be doing. Okay, and then center the hurt. This is the piece around not taking it personally, right? It's not about you and your feelings of guilt and your feelings of being offended, or funnily enough, your feelings of being labeled. That, to me, the irony is always tragic in those instances. Oh, I just feel like I'm being labeled as a bad person. I'm like, you don't want to be labeled to the people you were racist to? Do you not see how this is really strange? And then lastly, divest from forgiveness. Okay, communities and individuals do not owe you forgiveness, don't owe you rewards for doing the labor of apologizing and being accountable and transparent. And then lastly, at the end of the day, when you divest from forgiveness, you do the work because it's important, and you do the work for the sake of the work itself, not because you need to be given, be freed of your guilt in whatever capacity. And that's, I think, we can practice in our personal lives, but also institutionally. There was a question, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I think I'm going to go to our strategy question. And then I'm going, because some of the questions that are coming in right now I think are relevant to that. And then I'll prod us in that direction if they're not being answered directly. So at this point, I'm going to ask you, what are some action items, best practices, or strategies for meaningfully increasing, oh my God, I can't even speak words, for meaningfully addressing anti-Black racism in designing and implementing youth programming?
I think it's, go ahead, Kofi.
Okay, thank you. So there's a couple places I think we can think about. I think it starts with staffing for me. The design can be great, but I've seen designs for youth programs that are not so hot, but they have good staff who can build relationships and they make it work. They create those environments that move forward. So a lot of it, if you are in a management or leadership role, is who you hire, and never rushing a hire because we had to start the program this month. Go back to that funder and say you need 2 more months if you do not have the staff who has the cultural competency to deliver it for the young people you're serving. Otherwise, the entire thing is going to be uphill from then on. I think part of that staffing is about relationships, especially with highly marginalized youth. You need folks who can build relationships and a focus on taking the time and doing activities that build those relationships into the design. So one of the things we did at C is every program we do starts with a 3-day retreat outside of the city. And people will resist it, and young people say, no, but I've got things to do, or this or that. But it is so important to our design that we spend time to say, you're not just going in another program. You're not just stepping in another space. We're actually trying to build a community of dedicated Black professionals and young people who are also professionals who are all trying to move together. So take that time. I think we have to talk programs for Black peoples around healing and trauma and space to acknowledge the traumas from the educational system, the traumas from policing, the traumas from just being Black in this world, and give places for healing. It can't just be on content. We sometimes have to give the room for spaces to heal. And then I think it's talking about identity, really having spaces where we can talk about identity in an honest place, but not in an abstract place. And sometimes that needs role models, people that people can look up to and say, okay, especially for our young men, I see how you are living out this idea of being, a strong Black man who's also a caring and compassionate father, or also a loving partner, or also someone who has strong Black male identity but is queer. All these different things that we have to model. One of the best ways to do it is by bringing in folks who can show it and allow people to see outside of what they may have seen in their own life experiences or their neighborhoods. And so exposure is another piece for programming for our youth, taking them out of places. They're tired of sitting in a gym and getting a can of pop and a bag of chips and just some chart paper on the wall. For us, we say the whole city is our classroom, and part of education in an experiential way is taking people out of their community and into different spaces and showing this entire nation is yours. It should be seen as a place that you have ownership and rights to, and you should feel that connection, but you may not have because of the experiences you've had up until this point. So let's allow the programming to be part of that process of reclaiming the ownership of this space that you're in.
I think what I wanted to add is involvement of young people in the framing of the program that they're going to participate in. I think all too often a group of us sit at the table and like, oh yeah, let's do this program, and young people are going to come out to it. But at no point did we have several young people sitting at that table to say, yeah, that's a good idea. No, I'm not going to come. No, my friends are not going to come. So I think it's really important for young people to be there to frame the program, what it's going to look like, what the outcomes are, what are their inputs. Employing some of them to work in that program so that they're getting something out of it as well. I think that's really key. I think something that we also need to do, and I know people have kind of stepped away from it. I remember when I was programming, is having parental involvement. We always plan programs for our young people like they're standalone. Young people are attached to families, they're attached to parents. It's very important that parents know where their young people are going, the type of programming that they're involved in, having some input, seeing what their young people are investing their time in and what they're getting out of it as well. So I think for me, those are 2 key things that when you're doing programming that you need to really consider and we need to really get back to when we're working with our young people.
Thank you, Trevon.
Where do I even add at this point? I think for me, just kind of adding on to what both Juliet and Kofi mentioned was agency collaboration. So oftentimes when we have an agency or an organization, we may be stuck, right? We may think this is the best that we can do, and we may be kind of caught up in our own program and processes that can use some other collaboration, right? Collaboration is a beautiful thing, right? That's how society works. That's how my discipline works, right? It's never just child and youth work. It's all interdisciplinary. We have social workers, we have doctors. It's really about grabbing on everyone and anyone's expertise to add to a common goal, right? So even maybe connecting with an organization like YouthRex that might provide you with intentional programming, best practices, evidence to support what you're doing, webinars that kind of talk about these complex issues that seem to be a personal but very connect to a political and bigger issue. So allowing for that educational piece to kind of seek more than what we know, constantly being hungry to do better and improve programming for young people.
Yeah, you were speaking earlier, Trevon, before we got into the webinar about jargonisms and labels, and then we got a question about that actually from the audience, and I feel like you should speak to that a little bit if you're comfortable.
Yeah, for sure. So jargons, right? Oftentimes we speak and communicate in ways that may seem just natural and really unoffensive, but in actuality, these words, linguistics of things, it's very critical, right? And when we say things like at-risk youth, right, we're now labeling the young person before even putting them before their exceptionalities or their adversities, right? So being mindful of the impact of language and having a strength-based lens whenever we frame things, right? When we're working with a young person that might be diagnosed with exceptionalities, being mindful of not saying things that make them feel lower or lesser than, right? Being aware of these unique and things that we all go through and not framing them in deficit-based manners, right? Pathological ways. It's being strength-based and saying that you are resilient in who you are, right? And allowing the language, right? When we speak, there's power behind that, right? So when we're speaking to these young people, these young fragile minds, we need to be mindful that every word we use in our intervention needs to have intentionality and intentions behind them. So it's not of excuse for a practitioner not to know. We have to do our due diligence and being aware and conscious of everything we do when working with young people who face adversities.
Thank you so much for that. I think myself, I remember, I'm older now, but I remember being a youth, and I remember, youth workers and organizations and institutions coming into my neighborhood and calling us troubled. And I was like, actually, the trouble is with y'all. Like, really and truly, I'm just here living my life, right? And that was something that is, I think it's either that or we just like attach this label of resilience onto Black kids, and we just don't really understand the harm in like either or. Can we be allowed contradiction and nuance and complication? Can we have challenges and barriers that don't, when we call someone at risk or trouble, we say that the problem is with them.
Yeah.
Okay, the problem is not with us. The problem is with the barriers and the systems that prevent us from navigating our lives in ways in which we can do more than just survive, right? So for me, something that's really critical to me is confronting the narrative of resilience. The narrative of resilience for me can be really, really harmful. I get that all the time. Oh, Ronnie, you're so strong. You're so resilient. I was like, resilience is a trait that is earned through trial by fire. It is not a choice. Okay, resilience is an armor that made up of 1,001 scars. Resilience is not a choice for Black children. What choice do we have? Be resilient or lay down and die. That's it, right? So celebrating that, is really, to me, is a part of that, trauma tourism that we do with young Black people, of like, walk me through all your horrible experiences so I can develop some sense of empathy for you and then applaud you for having survived that. We don't actually have a choice but to survive. And resilience means you can take it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We use resilience to justify a lot of things that happen to young Black people. And at the end of the day, like, I don't want to be resilient. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'd like to be soft and fucked up because that's what's happened. That's the world around me, and that's the impact that has landed on me as a result of it. And then when we talk about resilience, we don't tend to leave a lot of room for conversations around the mental health of young Black people. And then we get asked questions that somebody asked in the last webinar, and that Cyril problematized really well, which was, why do we think that young Black people who experience racism have mental health issues as a result of it? And definitely, do you think humans who are consistently being dehumanized will have a mental health response to that? Absolutely. And I think when we frame it in particular ways, it says to us that we actually think that Black people are not human in a full capacity. So that to me is something to think about. In terms of tangible strategies, community consultation. And I'm not talking about you come into a community, you rent out the gymnasium in the local community center, you host some consultations with some Timbits, and then you do whatever you want at the end of the day. When we consult with communities, we need to set goals in conjunction with those communities, measurable goals, and involve communities in the evaluation process as well. At the end of the day, when you're going to take my stories, my lived experience, I need to know what you're going to do with it. I need to know that you're going to honor it. There's so many examples of Black communities being quote unquote consulted when it comes to redevelopment of our neighborhoods, programming, youth programming, education, and then none of that actually going to inform the actual design of it. And then I'll talk about something that's meaningful inclusion. Okay, meaningful inclusion is, in terms of my practice, is more than a seat at the table. Okay, I don't want you to invite me to your dinner party as an afterthought. I want to be part of the decision-making process. I want to fold our napkins into opera houses and not swans. Everybody knows that's cuter. I want to pick our table settings. Okay, maybe I'm going to eat with my hands. Maybe I'm a vegetarian. Maybe I'm a vegan. Maybe it's Ramadan and I'm fasting. Maybe I only eat halal or kosher. Maybe I'm allergic to something. Maybe I have health issues and dietary restrictions. Maybe your table is too high for my friend in a mobility device. When there are more people who are in the margins involved in the decision-making capacity, the design of the programming will fit us in ways, and that will amplify the impact of that. And then also be really wary of how we use our expertise as, oh, I'm a professional in this sector, to silence young people who are talking about their lived experience. That happens so frequently where young people, it's like you have expert power as a youth worker or as a consultant, as an academic, and then you use that expert power instead of a position of advocacy, but you use it to silence people. And then thinking about holistic supports for youth, so that they're not just there for the duration of your program every Thursday from 6 to 9, and then the rest of the week, that's it. So connecting with other organizations, collaboration. There's such a strange culture of competition in the not-for-profit world, particularly in the youth serving sector, is that, I was consulting for an organization and they were really upset that I'd taken on a client that does similar work in another part of the city. And they said, they're our direct competitors. And I said, okay, what are you selling? And they were like, I'm like, yeah, they're not your competitors. There's so much work to do. I understand that we're quote unquote competing for funding, but when we collaborate, that actually helps to amplify the impact of the dollars that we get from whatever space. And then also make sure they're youth in your paid leadership positions in your organization. Paid, money talks. Make sure youth can survive, get paid for their work, get paid for their labor, get valued, because that translates into throughout all our lives. Yeah, I don't know if there was anything else that I wanted to add in that. If there is, I will share on Twitter if people are interested in this. It's going to be an image file, and I'll share the text because it's so long. I'll share it on my Facebook page, which is organizational practices for fostering anti-oppression or anti-oppressive practices in your organization. I'll just share a list of like 10 practices or so. We're not going to have a mountain of time to go through certain things, but I did want to talk about, there are 2 questions that came in from participants. The first was that, what do you think are some strategies for collecting accurate or participant-informed data, and are there some specific questions that you find are not being asked in data collection?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Because when I think about evaluation, I often have to like logistically lay things out to give a correct answer around how to typically phrase a question or frame it. So when I think about data collection in terms of youth voice, I think one of the first things we need to ask is why we want to collect the voice. What outcome is this going to serve to help benefit, right? Because when we collect data, oftentimes we don't know why we want it. It just sounds like a very, very good thing to do because a lot of other people are doing it. But when we have data, we want to make sure it's correlated to an outcome. So that way we can gauge activities, right, to make things better, enhance our programming to then mitigate a disparity or an impact. So I think when we're thinking about framing these questions, we also need to think in a bigger context, why? What outcome do we want to kind of fix? What do we want to do better for these young people? And then definitely allow them to kind of speak free-flowingly in a safe room. So be mindful that if we have all the staff and managerial place in the context of these questions, it may veer or shift the questions, right? Maybe allowing for a dialogue amongst young people, right? More of a focus group style where they can collaborate and work alongside each other to say, hey, yeah, that was a great idea. I went through this. And then allow them to speak from that lived experience perspective versus more so of a controlled environment where it's more asking direct questions. Allow for that genuine flow of things, a very natural feel when we're asking these questions. And once again, the outcomes. Be sure to ask why we even need this data in the first place.
Thank you.
I think the other thing about data collection is trust and relationships, right? I think you, like anything else, you need to do multidisciplinary approaches, but if it's an evaluator that the youth don't know who's suddenly showing up midway through project or calling them on the phone, asking invasive questions, you're not going to get good data.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's important, even if it is a third-party evaluator, and that person is culturally competent, that the first time they, you see them is not when they're asking them, have you been in conflict with the law? And is this going on in your family? That there's someone who's actually taken time to build some trust with the young people. And that there's got to be some reciprocity, right? And we found if you want someone to come back for a focus group or to re-engage afterwards with your program, what are you offering them? And not just a gift card, but are they going to be able to get learning or skills, or is it through a social activity? And then at the end you say, hey, we just want to ask you 3 questions about your experience 6 months ago. But you've got, we sometimes can be so extractive with the young people, and they know it, right? They're not dumb. They can understand that this relationship, that you are just mining them for their valuable information. And I think sometimes it's being honest too. Like I'll go in the room if we're doing a focus group and I'll say, yo, listen, our funders need to know about this. This is how we pay the bills. I know you guys appreciate what was happening. I know that, this might be going deeper than you may want to go, and you don't have to go there, but this is why we need this information. And I think if you have a relationship of trust, you can just be real with people. You can tell them this is why we're having it. But so often data collection, it's happening and it's not even clear to young people why you're taking this data, or they read between the lines. So I think openness and transparency is also a key technique to getting honest answers.
And I think it's important making sure the evaluator is there from the onset of the program. And I think it's also having a small group of the young people work with the evaluator to frame some of those questions. Yeah. Because they know what they will tell someone. And so if they're working with the evaluator to frame the question to get the data, I think that is so important. And that's something that, I'm going to be working with a group of young people on an anti-Black racism leadership program. And I was saying, I reached out to Trayvon and saying, I want you to come. I want you to meet the young people. I want to know that you're an evaluator, and I want, they're going to be compensated. So I want a small group of them to work with him to even get the skills. So later on, whenever they're involved in any type of programming, that they understand the importance of evaluation, they understand the importance of collecting data, and that they learn the skills that we don't always have to go to an expert or somebody who's being paid big bucks to do it, that we have a trained group of young people who can go out from different communities and different programs and do some of this evaluation themselves and collect some of this data on behalf of an organization.
Thank you so much, folks. Just to kind of wrap up this particular question, just informed consent around the data collection, and like really, really informed, and that people don't feel that's actually important for the integrity of the data itself, right? That way people are not just answering it because they just want to get it over with. You're actually getting really genuine data. That data, again, has to be intersectional. And then when we're talking about practical solutions and strategies, often that's the question that I get so every panel, every workshop, every consultation. There is no recipe, okay? There is no one size fits all solution. There is no, this is how you fix it. Okay, there's only consultation, intimate knowledge of your communities, those communities being in leadership positions. There's lots of practices that we can do to best inform how to address a particular issue, barrier, or gap in services. But that all has to be rooted in that intersectional anti-oppressive practice and a commitment to Black communities and Black youth And then Black youth will participate more if they see themselves reflected.
Yeah.
I as a speaker, I get warned sometimes when I'm going to certain spaces, particularly when I'm speaking at quote unquote alternative schools. Whenever I get invited as a speaker there, I get warned by every educator, oh, it's a tough group, it's a tough group, it's a tough group. And I get in and I'm like, yo, my name is Rania, I'm from Regent Park, and everything is, all the barriers are down, right? Then I can have a real conversation. And I also, coming in from that place of, this is a troubled group, this is an at-risk community, puts people in a place of, it's adversarial. People are in a defensive and not receptive place, and it sets up a really harmful power dynamic. So coming in and I'm like, hi, my name is Rania. I'm also, recently graduated from being an at-risk youth. So being able to really bring in people that reflect their lived experiences is really critical. We do not have a mountain of time left. I think we've got about 2 minutes, and I want to be really respectful of people's time. I know it's the middle of the workday for folks. So I'm not going to volunteer the other panelists to do this, but I will invite you to tweet at me, and if it's a question that I can answer. I think I missed the question actually from the audience, is whether this information is being integrated into education from K to 12 into the school curriculum. No, it is not being integrated into the school curriculum conversations, particularly around anti-Black racism. Unfortunately, when you get these kind of provincial directives that are coming down, it takes forever for it to make its way into any particular ministry in a profound way, particularly in getting something in the curriculum for the Ministry of Education in Ontario is tremendously challenging. And there's also so many teachers that are reporting a lot of resistance around even talking about anti-Black racism, and students who are being policed around talking about Black experiences. And I'm hearing a lot of those stories now because it's Black History Month, and I encourage everyone to remember that even though this event or webinar is taking place in February, the rest of us are Black in January, February, March, April, June, July, the whole year. So being conscious of how that, anti-Black racism is a year-round experience, multi-seasonal, multifaceted, and to think about that constantly. Thank you. I'm super grateful for everyone who was able to join us here today. Thank you for your wisdom, for your expertise, for your insights. I learned a lot, and it's always a pleasure to be around people who are brilliant like you, and hopefully we will connect again soon. Thank you so much for your time and your energy. Again, connect with me on Twitter and YouthRex on Twitter if you have any questions. Thanks a million. Go enjoy this one sunny day that we got.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye.
Bye. Oh.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you again to Rania, to Kofi, to Trevon, and to Gillette for sharing with us today. And we encourage you all to share your feedback on today's session with us. You will receive a link to fill that out and let us know what you thought. You can continue the conversation on Twitter. We're at Rex for Youth, and we look forward to welcoming you all to our next webinar. Stay tuned for details. Thank you all so very much for being with us today.